Thank you. Talking to the panelists, they would prefer if we have questions at the end with all three, because I think some of our questions may be answered collectively. So if we could hold our questions till the end, and we'll go on to our next speaker. I did want to mention also in the agenda at the lunch session, there'll be boxed lunches. And if you come back here, those of you that have that are around, there'll be a debriefing session that Dr. Page would like us to attend. So that's at right after the lunch. If you could bring it in here, there'll be a debriefing session. Okay, our next speaker is Dr. Rod Page. Probably needs no introduction. He is a director of the Flint Animal Cancer Center at Colorado State University and is the Stephen Withrow Presidential Chair in Oncology. Rod?
Thank you, Dr. Larimore, and thank you for your attendance and your interest. I also want to send out a thank you to our sponsors, which have made this workshop possible. There's a bit of an old proverb that goes, vision without execution is hallucination. And it was really, I think, Thomas Edison that changed that around a bit and said, vision without funding is hallucination. So I want to thank all of our sponsors for making this possible. As we were anticipating this workshop, we did feel like it would be very useful to create another workshop, a pre-workshop, on the discussion about some of the changes that have occurred over a relatively short period of time in terms of approval of clinical trials that are important to understand, as well as some of the current policies, ethics, and some of the ways that we might begin to think about building a best practice recommendation set that would be based on trying to integrate some of the clinical trial products or clinical trial process so that it would be possible to gather data in a way that would be contiguous with some of the human clinical trial data. So there's a tremendous amount of information that was available to draw from, and you'll see through the presentation that we have actually, and I've listed a lot of the documents and a lot of the guidance that was the basis for some of the recommendations that came out of this workshop. These are the individuals. You can see that it is a very diverse group. There were individuals that are clinical trialists, veterinary clinical trialists, a number of folks that help to manage IACUC approval processes, individuals that are at the Institute of Laboratory Animal Medicine, a division of the National Academy of Sciences, which is the parent organization for the IOM, the Division of Animal Welfare for the AVMA, welfare consultants, and a number of other individuals that really helped to make this thing happen. And it was supported by the Shipley Foundation predominantly, and we're very grateful for that. So we began by disclosing and talking and thinking about what some of the guiding principles might be for a set of recommendations that would lead to a more robust and a more fulfilling and a better practice situation for conducting clinical trials. We felt that obviously clinical trials must preserve patient well-being. They must provide for best supportive care and the relief of pain and other distressing symptoms. This is sort of a fundamental concept now that's embedded into clinical trials and should always be a fundamental precept on which we move forward. We also felt that all clinical trials should be peer-reviewed for scientific and therapeutic merit, particularly feasibility, sound design, and absence of redundancy. While the majority of trials in veterinary oncology are peer-reviewed, not all are. Commercially sponsored trials are sometimes not peer-reviewed. Some of the trials that are sponsored by philanthropy and some of the trials that are underwritten by hospital revenue are not peer-reviewed. This was a precept of clinical trial conduct that was adopted by ASCO over 10 years ago, that every trial needs to be peer-reviewed. Under the normal set of circumstances, if a trial is not peer-reviewed, it will still have to receive IACUC approval, which is a form of review. It's often limited to the animal welfare aspects of trials or of animal research. And that's extremely valuable. And for results that are published, an IACUC approval is required. But that often is missing in some areas. They're not necessarily equipped to deal with assessment of the clinical merit, of the clinical relevance of a particular trial. What about accrual needs and oversight, feasibility, and some of the other things that are probably more relevant to clinical trials than they are to the traditional laboratory animal type of research. The consent process. This has to be given, I think, a rethinking. How do we do a really good job? It's really, how do you do a really good job of consenting in this process? And I'll spend a lot more time in the next couple of slides speaking about some of the recommendations that were made, some of the conversations we had, and I want to make it clear that these were developed independent of resources. It's very difficult for many academic and other institutional or other organizational entities in veterinary medicine to rise to the resource level that's required to meet some of the guidance and some of the requirements for conducting human clinical trials. We really are more than an order of magnitude less in capacity in terms of just personnel and resources. The Office of Research Integrity kind of dominates the accountability and oversight of research conduct, including clinical research. And there are very clear guidelines that are established and could be readily adopted, I think, in terms of management and oversight of clinical research in companion animals to a certain extent, to the extent we can. Some things are obviously not capable or relevant, but I think overall the type of things that are important to consider are pretty much contained in documents like the PDF that's listed here. And we also felt strongly that this is a moving target, that there has to be some ongoing improvements in education, clinical trial conduct, and oversight in order to make appropriate animal health recommendations and to translate such data into human health. I wanted to sort of review this particular algorithm. This is from a recent review by Philippe Benoit, who runs the animal care division at Cornell. And this is the sort of the way that clinical research is managed at Cornell. And this has been essentially a fundamental change over the last 3 to 5 years, where there has been the development of a committee, an advisory committee to IACUC that helps to address some of those issues that I mentioned related to assessment of clinical studies. So it begins at the top with the fundamental question: are you going to be doing anything different than you would ordinarily be accomplished through a client-patient relationship? If you're basically going to do retrospective review and you're just going to take some of the residual samples or some of the medical record information, you don't need to file an IACUC. You know, on a prospective basis, you do need to file for an IACUC approval if you're going to be collecting anything more than what would be collected during the course of a normal workup in a patient. So it goes through sort of a yes-no diagram. This aspect of it over here on the right-hand side at the top is actually a policy, the source of a policy now that was developed by the AVMA and approved by the AVMA, that this is essentially their definition as well of when an IACUC is required and when it is not. As you go through the process of evaluation of projects such as clinical trials, where you're going to do an interventional trial or you're going to do some sort of data gathering that might create a need to have an evaluation, the answers basically tell you whether or not you need to submit an IACUC. If you do, this committee, they call it the College of Veterinary Medicine Research Committee, will review the initial application. They will suggest any changes that need to be made to the PI, which will be then revised and submitted back to IACUC. And IACUC, with the consent and with the approval of the recommendations from the CVMRC, they're able to grant an expedited review. If they disagree, then they go back for a full review. Okay, so this is a way, I believe, that we can do a better job of making sure that there's clinical relevance to each study. Not every study probably should be done. Just because we can doesn't mean we should. As well as look at some of the issues related to patient population that's going to be accrued, some of the other more detailed combinations of drugs and types of evaluations that are necessary. So the informed consent process, and I want to emphasize that we're talking about a process. We're not talking about an informed consent form. This is not just a form, it's an entire process that requires a significant amount of investment and a significant amount of commitment in order to do it right. So it's the ethical assurance of companion animal patient welfare and owner comprehension of clinical trial goals and compliance. And I think this is one area where we can harmonize quite easily with the types of informed consent process guidance for which humans undergo as well. The compliance and the types of things that are required to occur or required to be included in an informed consent process are described by the Health and Human Services office here, and this is the policy. And you can click on this, and we do a pretty good job of including all of the detailed lists of things that need to be included, but I don't think we always are as complete or as thorough as we really should be. There's also clearly been years and years of renewal and revision and understanding that the clinical consenting process changes. Currently, this is the FDA's regulatory guidance on the informed consent process. And this organization here, Primer, is a public research in medicine and public responsibility in medicine and research. It's a little hard to sort of figure out exactly what all those R's are. So public responsibility in medicine and research. It's a really interesting website. They cover both human and animal research ethics, and it's worth using information that you might be able to find in that particular organization that will help to understand some of the sort of the dialogue that's going back and forth between advocates and the government. In 2013, NCI changed their template for informed consent to reduce the number of pages, reduce the language to an understandable and very clear sort of description, and still meeting all of the FDA guidance requirements. This is where you can find that protocol for the template, and the CSU Cancer Center has revised our informed consent template to be aligned with this particular change in the type of forms that's used. If you want that, we can easily get that for you. So the informed consent process itself, what were some of the recommendations that came out of our workshop? We believe that a really strong informed consent includes the entire team. In many cases, the ideal informed consent is conducted by a neutral party, either a nurse that may be involved with the study, a person who's purposely trained to do that, and in a very ideal setting, there should be a witness, independent of those involved with the trial and itself, the owner of the pet. Realizing that that is often challenging, it still should be a goal, and I think we should raise our bar as far as we can, and something to sort of manage over the course of time, and to think about how we could really improve the type of consent that we do by making sure there's no there's no real conflict and there's no real misunderstanding. It requires a tremendous amount of training to accomplish this in a human clinical trial setting. Clarifying the study purpose sounds simple. It's really not. It's really important, I think, to make it clear to the owner whether this is a study that will be conducted to address supportive care, patient management of pain and side effects only. Will this be a tolerability trial? Will this be an efficacy trial? And in terms of being thoughtful and transparent, I think it's also important to make sure that there's an understanding by the owner whether this is going to be a trial that is directed at animal health, human health, or both. There needs to be a thorough description and a transparent scenario for the study design and the interventions that are going to be requested. Is this going to be a placebo trial? And are there ways to talk about even small risks that a patient might be put under if there is a delay in implementing a new therapeutic or moving off the trial into a conventional therapeutic plan? Describing the interventions, how much sampling is going to be done? What sort of schedule is going to be required in order for the owner to comply with this? These are all generally discussed, but in more detail, I think it will provide a better platform and a better level of understanding and trust that is essential to improving conduct of the innovations that we're trying to accomplish. What is a funding source? This is oftentimes not disclosed to owners. I think that they have some interest in knowing whether or not this is going to be a study that's funded through a commercial contract, a peer-reviewed grant, another source, because it does have some implications in terms of conflict of interest. Are any of the personnel that are conducting the trial involved with either direct funding from the trial or have a stake in a company that is funding the trial? The compensation is an area that I know we talk about a lot. It's an important incentive for owners to consider enrolling in trials, but it does put a client into a vulnerable position. This may be a vulnerable position that's not difficult to deal with or difficult to describe, but in some cases it does create a sort of a difference in perceived power. And I think those are issues that we need to develop a communication plan around. I don't think we should, and we can't really stop providing that. It would create a real issue, but I know we can come up with a communication plan that will allow us to honestly and thoroughly make the owner understand what will be occurring in the trial that their pet's involved with. Identifying a real advocate of the patient and how to provide this client support. As I mentioned, oftentimes the primary advocate will be the principal investigator or a member of the team, and there may need to be additional advocates for this patient that, and for the client. Could be a specialist veterinarian that referred them for the trial, could be their private practicing veterinarian, could be someone within the unit that has some distance from the trial. And we want to understand just exactly how well things have been retained following a good informed consent. So there are lots of ways we can do that. Let me switch for a minute to post-approval monitoring. This is a concept that is somewhat minimal in our field, I have to say. It was originally developed as a way for laboratory animal studies to be followed when there was an increased level of pain expected, so that there would be clear oversight and some evaluations that would be conducted from an independent, usually a veterinarian within the university laboratory system, lab animal system. I think those types of things can also be embedded into a clinical trial program. It will take a tremendous amount of education about what these really mean, how to implement them, and what the types of things that would need to be monitored. The National Clinical Trials Network has audit guidelines that are listed here, and their criteria for conducting audits basically falls into, are the eligibility criteria preserved throughout the trial? Is the informed consent process reasonable? Is there protocol compliance, adverse event reporting? Those are not different from what we should be able to evaluate as well. It's also important that there be some sort of a confidential contact process from anyone in the trial conduct or within the staff or within the sphere of influence that would provide some sort of a hotline, an ombudsman, or some sort of a way that there could be a reporting of any potential ethical or protocol breaches. We also felt that the follow-up and reporting and publication of clinical trials is something that we're probably not addressing very well. We do not have a clinical trial registry in veterinary oncology, similar to clinicaltrials.gov. There is a voluntary listing within the Veterinary Cancer Society. The COTC has a listing, and a lot of individual academic institutions and other institutions do have listings of clinical trials that are on their websites. But it's not a registry in the true sense. And there are a number of reasons why that's important. Obviously, to register any trial provides a catalog of trials that have been initiated and allows for the open access of clinical trials to patients and physicians. And the publication, as Dr. Vail mentioned, basically related to consort guidelines and changes that are occurring relatively rapidly in many, many journals that now require increased accountability of animal use, open access to all primary data, including negative studies. So a number of journals now are in the process of making sure they follow through on the type of work that is going to be obviously applicable to what we do. So how do we actually do this? How do we adopt a type of best practice recommendation set? I don't know yet. We need to have some sort of a more broad experience with comments, with input. Part of it is this organization and this workshop that we can use to launch into a more robust discussion. We know that there'll be regular reviews and revision. We want to encourage research on how well we're doing with comprehension and enrollment and retention, and how do we improve what we can accomplish. Education is obviously an important piece of this, all the way from clients, patients, not exactly educating patients, clients, students, and all professional levels. And then a big deal is promoting awareness and value. So if we can pull this off, adopting a best practice approach to clinical research by improving scientific and ethical conduct of trials, providing extraordinary protection for our animal patients and their owners will, I think, improve our trust, which will obviously lead to increased participation, better integration, and better healthcare shared between all species. So appreciate your time.